Hello Netrunner fans, Willing Dunn here, and I'm back for another data pack review. Today we're looking at Up and Over, and this pack's coming at a pretty timely moment in Netrunner since Worlds is just a couple weeks away. Let me start by saying that I think this pack is pretty runner favored, so make sure you tune into part 2 where I ramble about how good those cards are. That said, there's still quite a bit of good stuff for Corp, and we're going to start by taking a look at these. The first card that we have is actually the one that was designed by the 2012 World Champion, Jeremy Zwern. And if you don't know, if you win the World Championship in Netrunner, they allow you to work with them to create a card. So this was the card that the first World Champion created. It's called Architect. It's 4 to res, 2 influence, 3 strength. It's a Century. And this is a pretty unusual one. It cannot be trashed while installed. And then it has 2 subroutines. The first one is the Corp looks at the top 5 cards of R&D and may install one of those cards, ignoring all install costs. And the second sub is the Corp may install a card from Archives or HQ, paying all costs. Well, there's a lot going on with this card, so let's take it line by line. First, cannot be trashed while installed. This means by either player. That's something that strikes me about it. So, you can't install over this piece of ice if you want to get rid of it for one reason or another. Kind of unusual. Also, can't be parasited and this kind of stuff. And I'm pretty much always in favor of making Parasite worse in Netrunner. The first subroutine, I don't know how much I think this really matters. I do think it's kind of interesting, and there's some cool stuff you could do with that, especially with maybe like asset econ or this kind of thing. I could see this being the core of a deck that played a pretty low amount of ice and instead used this card to install lots of assets and things like that. But the one that's really getting me is the second subroutine. So this is going to let you reuse your asset econ. It's going to let you reuse things that, ice that you've lost to Parasite or this kind of stuff. I really like that second subroutine, and I think that that's what really makes the card. This is another card that I see the RP crowd at least considering because of the synergy with the asset econ and the RP ID. The problem I see with this card is it's not going to be very general use. I think barring the asset econ or something like that, you're really going to have to build your deck around this card working, because I don't see it being that effective as just like an ice accelerator or something like that. I think it's got to be part of your asset economy to really be worth playing. The next card we're going to talk about is also HB. It's an operation called Peak Efficiency. Costs 1, and it says gain 1 credit for each rezzed piece of ice, and it costs 1 influence. So the immediate comparison that I have is to green level clearance, which is just a set 3 money for the 1 cost, and it also lets you draw a card. Same influence and everything. I think in an overwhelming number of the current decks, green level clearance is better. But I've talked in the past about how I'm in favor of unusual new economic options, and I really like this one as one of those. I think it's very possible to see HB decks or other Glacier-style decks that play a whole ton of ice, and this is going to be more of a late-game economy card for them than it is like the early-game burst econ of green level clearance. The first place that my mind went was Next Design, because Next Design can start with essentially 3 ice in play. And I've sort of toyed around in the past with the idea of a Next Design deck that plays a ton of ice, like 26 to 30 ice, and abuses beta test and this kind of stuff. I think that deck is still 1 card off, but it's a card that's been spoiled, and I don't really want to talk about it, but I do think that deck could exist in the future, and Peak Efficiency is a really neat tool for them. The next card that we have is a 5-for-3 agenda for Jinteki. It's called Labyrinthine Servers. It's a security type. place 2 counters on it when you score it, remove a counter, prevent the runner from jacking out. The runner cannot jack out for the remainder of this run. There's really no way around it. This card sucks. I've talked in the past about how I really don't like prevent jack out effects for Jinteki because I think that the good runners already play in such a way that preventing them from jacking out isn't going to do anything. But the real stinker here is that this is attached to a 5-for-3 agenda body. To say that the runner is going to be able to see this coming is a vast understatement. You have to basically halfway win the game to get this effect to work. And then on top of that, it just sits there in the score area where the runner can just know that you're able to do it at any time. That's, of course, assuming that you're able to score a 5-for-3 agenda in your deck that contains this card. I'll give 2 possible uses for this card. One is with Mushin Notion versions of Personal Evolution. I could see that maybe being something they would consider over Future Perfect, maybe. I also have, in the past, conceptualized the idea of a Jinteki deck that could create lethal servers so that running on those servers at a certain point in the game would be essentially impossible. I could see maybe this fitting into that kind of thing, but I'm not going to be working on that deck. Mercifully, the next Jinteki card in the pack is quite good. It's a piece of ice called Ashigaru. It's 9 to res, 4 strength, it's a barrier, and it's 3 influence. Ashigaru gains subroutine and the run for each card in HQ. This card fits into the current card pool in a variety of really good ways. First, I think that it just gives Jinteki a good big barrier that they've kind of needed. I've seen quite a few competitive Jinteki decks that are playing Wall of Thorns and not really a whole lot of other net damage, and I think they just play Wall of Thorns because they want just a big old barrier that has relevant subroutines. This is certainly going to be better than Wall of Thorns in those decks. Also, this card is looking pretty good for Cerebral Imaging, because 1 or 2 copies of this is going to give you a incredibly huge number of subroutine piece of ice. And if they don't have Morningstar, it could make that server incredibly difficult to run. That said, the thing is only 4 strength, so it's definitely possible to Parasite Data Sucker this. And, I do think that there's ways to deal with this. It is worth noting that unlike Koma Inu, this has the subroutines before they run it. So, in other words, Femme Fatale won't be able to bypass this for 0. The next card that we have is also a Jinteki piece of ice. It's Mamba, 6 to res, 4 strength, 2 influence. It's a Century Psi AP. It has a hosted counter ability we'll get back to. Subroutine, deal 1 net damage. Then subroutine, play the Psi game. If you win, put a power counter on it. The power counter ability is do a net damage. Use this ability only during a run. I'm not really that impressed with this piece of ice. The biggest thing that's holding it back is the clause, use this ability only during a run on the power counter. I think if you could use the power counter during your own turn, or had the ability to combine this with Neural EMP and stuff like that, that could be really good. But the fact that you have to win the Psi game and then you put a power counter that you can only use during runs, not blowing me away. It's kind of expensive. I'm not immediately aware of a deck that I want to play this card, and I think it's increasingly going to be the case that runners have solutions to large sentries. Next up, we have an NBN asset. It's called Reversed Accounts, 0 to res, 3 to trash, 1 influence. It's a hostile asset. Can be advanced. It has click trash. The runner loses 4 credits for each advancement token on reversed accounts. The most obvious comparison that I can think of for this card is to Ronin, because it's an asset that you need to advance to be able to get a value, but then it has a really powerful effect associated with the advance. I think this card is mainly great because it has 1 influence and 3 trash cost. I think we're going to be able to see this card outside of NBN almost exclusively, and a lot of people have been suggesting using it in the Mushin Notion Personal Evolution decks. I don't really think the Mushin Notion PE deck needs this card, but I do agree with the sentiment that in order for this card to be really good, you're going to have some way to generate advancement counters for free. I don't really think this card is worth including in your deck if your only play with it is like install advance. Next up, we have another NBN card. This is a piece of ice. It's called Universal Connectivity Fee. 2 to res, 2 strength, trap type, and it's 1 influence. Subroutine, the runner loses 1 credit unless the runner's tagged. If the runner's tagged, he or she loses all credits in his or her credit pool, and the Corp trashes this piece of ice. I think I'm willing to say that this is the best trap piece of ice in the game. The big reason I say that is I think this card is pretty general use. It's 1 influence, and if you have the capability to give them tags, you can include this card as kind of a powerful alternative to just closed accounts. I've seen comparisons to Pop-Up Window with this card, and I don't know if I agree that they're fair. The big reason is that I think Pop-Up Window you include kind of as an economy slot in some decks. I know I include Pop-Up Window as sort of a soft economy card, and this certainly doesn't help you with the economy. You have to spend credits on it to res it, and then also it doesn't give you a credit whenever they encounter it. So this isn't really as good as like a reducer of R&D spam or that kind of thing, as much as like a nasty surprise. Next we come to what I think is pretty indisputably the most exciting Corp card in the pack, and that's a new Wayland ID called Blue Sun, Powering the Future. It's a 45-15 like normal, Identity Corp. When your turn begins, you may add 1 res card to HQ and gain credits equal to its res cost. So I think the obvious thing to say about this card is that ability is freaking incredible. I think it's fair to say that Blue Sun is the effect that gives you the most amount of credits of any burst economy card in the game. It's certainly the one with the easiest condition to meet. Now, this card relies on us using methods to res our ice so that we don't have to pay the full res cost for those ice, or else it doesn't really help us when we return them to hand and gain the credits. So we're mainly going to be talking about things that give us credits that we can spend on resing ice, or things that just res the ice outright. It's quickly worth noting that Blue Sun actually returns any res card, not just ice. It's just probably going to be easiest to do with ice. If you watch my other data pack reviews, you've heard me talk about how I thought Wayland was kind of in a bad place in the metagame, and I hoped that it would come back as a Glacier-style deck. And while I think it might be possible to play a Glacier style with Blue Sun, I kind of worry that it's just going to be another Scorched Earth deck, since it seems really powerful to return some giant piece of ice so that you have a ton of new credits to spend on the SEA source trace. This is a really well-designed card, and I'm just excited to see a Wayland deck enter the metagame before Worlds and before the big box. The next card is also a Wayland-y Glacier-y card, and it's called Changeling. It's 5 to res, 4 strength, 2 influence. It's a barrier morph. Changeling can be advanced. While Changeling has an odd number of advancement counters on it, it gains Century and loses barrier. And its only sub is End the Run. I mean, what can I say about this card? This is something that Wayland has needed. It's just a mid-range, good stop piece of ice. It's nice that it can become a Century, since Wayland doesn't have a lot of good Centuries that stop them. This is all around just a great addition to the Wayland arsenal. I think at 2 influence, it's probably not going to see play outside of Wayland, but I'm very much in favor of giving Wayland new tools and more options. Next up, we have another Wayland card. This one's an operation, and it's called Reuse. It's 0 to play, and it's a double, which means that as an additional cost to play it, you have to spend a click. It's trash any number of cards from HQ and gain 2 credits for each card trashed. It's a 1 influence card. I'm not really too excited about this card. I do think that there's some highly specialized uses for this card, and generally I'm in favor of weird specialized economy cards. The biggest thing, again, I'm seeing with this card is for cerebral imaging. There might be a reason that cerebral imaging wants to generate some totally ridiculous amount of credits all at once, and if you have like a 10, 20 card hand, it would be pretty easy to generate some stupid number of credits with this card. There might also be some decks in the future that use a lot of archives recursion stuff, like the Architect we saw earlier. So I don't really think that this card is all the way there yet, but it's an interesting card, and I like weird new economy things. Alright, next up we have another 5-for-3 agenda. This is a neutral one. It's unique, and it's called Hades Fragment. It's a source type. When your turn begins, you may add 1 card from archives to the bottom of R&D, and this is a limit 1 per deck card. So this effect is really powerful and unique and really good, and I very much like attaching those types of effects to agendas. So this is a really incredible design in my opinion. Now, I don't think that this is immediately going to be a game-breaking card, but I see it being the type of card that is going to expand options for decks in the future. Slow, big, glaciary-style decks are going to really like scoring this card because it's going to get to feed their economy stuff, especially if they're very operation-based with their economy. It's going to get to feed that stuff back into the deck so that they can just keep drawing it over and over and over, and that's also going to keep their agenda density low. The only deck I've messed around with this so far in is Bioroids, and it's quite good in there because you can just feed your operation economy back through, and that lets you be able to afford your giant dumb ice. Good power level on this for a 5-for-3 agenda. I really like this card. The final card is a neutral asset. It's called Doclands Crackdown. It's 2 to res, 3 to trash. Its ability is click, click, place 1 power counter on it. The install cost for the first card the runner installs each turn is increased by 1 for each power counter on it. This is a pretty unique way to attack the runner's economy. That said, I mean, this card is in the same pack as Reversed Accounts, which is certainly a more direct and I would say a better way to attack the runner's economy. But I could see this card being in a deck that somehow tries to lock the runner completely out of the game or force them to make really suboptimal runs to not be locked out of the game. You can imagine a deck that really focuses on trashing programs liking this card because then you could make the install cost of their replacement icebreakers very, very high. That said, this card is expensive and incredibly click intensive, so I don't really see it being too good in the near future. If we see a card that places power counters on cards, this card might become reasonable. Well, there were quite a few cool things in the Corp portion of this pack. You should definitely tune into the runner portion of the review. There's a lot of really neat stuff on that side, so we'll see you there. Thanks for watching, and be sure to click subscribe and like.